The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and today we are going to explore holistic biology. It almost seems like a contradiction of terms, but of course it's not, and my guest is Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris, author of A Walk Through History and co-author with Willis Harman of Biology Revisioned. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Glad to be here, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, biology, according to some, ought to be the center of all sciences. And yet it seems as if in our culture the center of all sciences is, I wouldn't even say physics, I'd say it's kind of engineering. We're still, many of us, stuck with a kind of mechanistic view of the world, so much so that we think of ourselves as being machines made out of meat. And we think of the whole living world as mechanisms rather than organisms.
Well, that's exactly what's happening now in science, is that we are making that shift from mechanism to organism, and that's what's so very exciting, that, the rise of Western science coincided with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and we were very fascinated by our machines and our ability to make machines, which gave us control over our creations, was then projected onto the whole cosmos. Yeah. And we're the only civilization I know of in history that had a concept of a non-living universe. That was our invention. Everybody knew what life and death was and recycling and things like that, but no other culture ever saw the universe as not alive and mechanical. So we're finally getting over that, and just in time.
Even as I recall, Sigmund Freud described the workings of the unconscious mind as being something like a pneumatic pump.
Yes, well, nothing can be described in the unknown without using metaphors of the familiar. Mm-hmm. And the mind is a good example of how we have changed our metaphors, where Freud did the plumbing system, the pipes and the valves and the faucet, and things got dammed up and jammed up and you had to release them and all that. And then we switched to the telephone network when we invented the telephone systems. And then we went to computers and holographic cameras, and now we're in parallel processors. So we take our latest invention and we forget that we copy nature and project those inventions onto our natural selves and the whole universe.
But in the field of biology, it seems as if some of the leading writers and spokesmen are adamant about hanging on to this mechanistic worldview. I'm thinking of particularly Richard Dawkins and his book, which has gotten so much attention, The Blind Watchmaker, that this is God as a blind watchmaker, and we're all the watches.
Well, I think the reason for that is that because physics was considered the king science, the regal science, all others had to try to fit themselves into that mold of mechanical physics. Well, the odd thing is that for half a century at least, physics has gotten beyond that mechanical mode, but biologists are still following it. Mm-hmm. So they still think in reductionistic mechanical terms. And that's why you get that kind of biology. Now, I've even, I believe, taken us beyond Darwin. If you look at the last 50 years of research, you find a very different pattern when the logic of organism is simply different from that of mechanism. And we now have, for example, a half a century of evidence in the laboratory that DNA rearranges itself intelligently when an organism is stressed, and that evolution actually, life is too intelligent to proceed by accident, I like to say. And the genetic accidents, which of course do occur, are quite rapidly repaired. This now reflects itself, for instance, in genetic engineering, where plants and animals often reject implanted genes the way our bodies do implanted organs. And so it doesn't work as well as the engineers would like it to. But we're learning now that we live in an intelligent universe, in an alive universe, and my biology revisioned book with Willis, of course, addressed that question: what if we made the assumption that consciousness was the source of all evolution rather than a late product of evolution?
Well, that's an idea that's consistent with spiritual teachings of the world's cultures. And it raises a big issue. For starters, for me, it raises, I'd like to distinguish between consciousness and intelligence. When an organism can somehow intelligently repair damage to its genes, I suspect that that's not conscious in the sense that we are conscious.
No, and that, of course, is a big problem in the field of consciousness, is that each of us has our own view of what it is and our definitions, and it's clear that consciousness is not the same across the board. You wouldn't expect universal consciousness, cosmic consciousness, God consciousness to have the same consciousness as you and I do, or as an ant does, or as a tree does. So we have, I like to think of it, as Ed Mitchell also does, as a learning universe. If you remember Alan Watts's The Book,
Yes.
which I think is as timely today as ever, his little story saying the universe is God playing hide and go seek with himself.
Yes.
Because God is everything, no one to play with when you're
The book about the taboo against knowing who you are is the full title, as I recall.
The idea is that the universe is God playing hide and go seek with himself, was the story he gave children.
I like that.
And he says, why would he play hide and go seek with himself? There's no one to play with when you're everything.
Yeah.
So he has to hide in the rocks, in the trees, in you and in me, and the game is to find ourselves. So I'm always looking for a complete worldview, a coherent one that will include physics and biology and spirituality in a single living universe.
So you're suggesting that consciousness, rather than being sort of the end product of evolution, is the beginning.
Yes, that we start with, consciousness is the best word we come up with at present for what the Greeks called the plenum, the fullness of potential, what David Bohm called the implicate order. There have been many names for it, the ether, nowadays it's zero-point energy. And it's the recognition that there is an intelligent, aware source playing itself out by creating material worlds such as our own. One of my friends calls this the creative edge of God. Humans within this planet now are the newest experience of the universe in what biologically always seems to come down to cycles of unity to individuation, through which arises conflict, negotiations happen, cooperation is arrived at, and we go to unity again at the next higher level. And that's why the story of evolution is so important today, to help us understand where humanity is and what is our next step. And we're right between that competition to cooperation phase.
Well, if I may probe with you about consciousness a little further, it's been my passion for decades. I'm fascinated by consciousness in all of its dimensions, and I struggle with the issue about consciousness and biology and consciousness and evolution, because it seems to me that as wonderful and vast as consciousness is, that the body itself has an intelligence of its own that is much larger than the conscious mind.
Absolutely. I think our our cells have a better handle on past, present, future than we do in our minds. In the spiritual traditions, it's always been understood that linear time is an artificial concept that we've imposed on the world for practical reasons of ordering our lives, but that the reality, the deep reality of the universe, is an eternal now in which everything is there. Now, today physics is showing us a non-local universe in which no information is ever lost. So we're getting confirmation of the old spiritual traditions, understanding that the universe exists as a totality in a non-time space sense, and then we string out individual lives and experiences, including the entire course of material evolution as we understand it. So God can only think, if you like, this basic God consciousness can only think about things that have been in the experience of the cosmos. That's why we're the creative edge of God, having the newest experiences that add into the total consciousness of the universe. So in that sense, at the beginning, it was something simpler than it is now. And it plays itself out in some organisms, such as bacteria or ants or trees, in a less complex way than it does in our minds. But our human minds, in a sense, are the first to pretend a disconnect from the rest of universal consciousness. And that was our mission of doing objective science. Here are we, here is the material world. And we have this interesting ability to make that pretense, to forget that this is a participatory universe that we're co-creating, and pretend that we can look at it from a distance. That's a new game. It's getting us into a lot of trouble, but it's also made us some very interesting new progress.
So you seem to be suggesting that what we think of as our consciousness may not really be much in the way of consciousness at all compared to our potential.
That's exactly right. When we merge our ability to be conscious about the world, as we call it, outside ourselves, and the world inside, when we realize that the inside world and the outside world are all part of the same keyboard. You know, the spiritual people have been playing up in the high keys, and the scientists have been playing down in the low keys. And then when they accepted electromagnetic energy as part of the world of science, because it became measurable, we learned how to transpose the music from that range to the world of matter and up. Now we're looking for what's the transform from the original, from the ever there source of plenum, implicate order, 0 point energy, whatever we're consciousness. What is the transform? How does matter come through electromagnetic energy into its low keys?
Well, that may be the subject for a different interview. I'd like to focus a little more on biology at the moment. And you're an expert in evolution. Your book, A Walk Through History, is
A Walk Through Time.
A Walk Through Time.
Yes.
Did I say it wrong when I introduced you? I apologize.
That's okay.
And I want to
No
correct
problem.
that now. A Walk Through Time is about evolution on this planet from the very earliest times. And you suggest that one way to look at biology completely different is to suggest that evolution isn't about the evolution of organisms so much. It could be viewed as the evolution of rocks.
Well, it's the evolution of the entire planet as a single entity.
Yeah.
And we have seen, well, first of all, we have a definition of life now. We didn't 20 years ago. Everybody thought someone else had a definition, and it never was basically defined. Now we have this definition called autopoiesis, which is a good Greek word meaning self-creation. And it says an entity that continually creates itself is a living entity. So if we look at the Earth, starting out as a uniform molten mass, and then cooling its crust, letting its magma break through that crust, a great cycle beginning, which now involves tectonic plates, the thick crust broken into pieces, which are renewed through seafloor rifts and volcanoes, and then are melted back down where the crusts, in the subduction zones, where one crust passes under another. So we have a cycle from magma to rocky crust on the surface and back down into the magma. Now, what we call the life forms, from bacteria to us, they package themselves out of eroding crust with terrific electromagnetic energy from the center of the Earth and from the top, because lava turns not only into rock, but into gases and steam. The steam piled up, the clouds rained down, the oceans formed, the weather cycles began. So the big, what we call geological cycle, then has these other cycles imposed on it, the weather-water cycles, the atmospheric cycles. And through the interaction of all of them, you get the self-creating organisms. Mm-hmm.
It's as if then the Earth as a whole is a living organism, a body. I guess the term might be called Gaia.
Gaia is the name that Jim Lovelock, of course, James Lovelock, who was an atmospheric scientist and an epidemiologist and a very broad thinker, gave to his hypothesis of the Earth as alive at the suggestion of novelist William Golding, who was a neighbor of Jim's. And, I sometimes say if they'd called it the George hypothesis, there might not have been such resistance to it among scientists. And George is actually, the word GE is the ancient name of Gaia, and the ORGE comes from the Greek word for plow, orgos. And it's the tiller of the earth, the farmer, is the Georg. So I don't know. I think there was resistance because Gaia was seen as a New Age goddess figure, and that interfered with the scientists really looking at the logic of the Earth as a living entity. It's a concept, not a theory. It's not something you prove. Our present concept is that nature is an assembly of mechanisms. Well, we can't prove that. That's a conceptual framework.
In fact, one of the things you point out is it doesn't do justice even to our idea of mechanism, because every mechanism has a creator with a purpose.
Well, now you're getting into why there's a fundamental illogic at the foundation of that scientific worldview.
Yeah.
Because we, originally the scientists had God as the grand engineer of the machinery of nature. That was the Cartesian worldview. And then scientists decided they had no need for the hypothesis of God, but they kept the idea of machinery. Now, there is no such thing as machinery without an inventor, as you just pointed out. So that's why you get Dawkins kind of concepts that if enough molecules blow around in a big enough wind over enough billions years, that these natural mechanisms will assemble themselves. And it doesn't work that way. And what we needed with this new definition of life as self-creation, you now had an immanent God, if you like. You no longer had the father figure outside of nature as the engineer of it, but now you have the self-aware universe, the conscious universe, creating itself, manifesting as a whole material universe, including planets like ours, which, like seeds scatter around the cosmos, some come alive.
And there is this larger sense. It's not only the planet that functions as akin to a living organism, but the cosmos itself. In the subtitle of your book, A Walk Through Time, From Stardust to Us, refers to the elements that cycle throughout the universe that are necessary for life.
That's right. And of course, astronomers talk about the birth and the life cycles and the deaths of stars, and how supernovas explode, and then their spawn, if you like, creates new solar systems, new star systems. And yes, I believe that we're in a fractal universe where the patterns repeat at all levels. And that's why looking at cosmology and evolution biology can show you what the basic game plan is in nature. And if we take our clues from that, then I think we can become a healthy species surviving into the future. If we don't pay attention to that grand context in which we were given birth, then we run so counter to it that we're going to knock ourselves out of the game.
Well, it seems to me that, in a way, our vision of the living world is limited because we've already destroyed a lot of it, or it's become, even before humans were created, much of it was destroyed. I'm fascinated by what is known as the Cambrian explosion, a period some 600 million years ago or more, where there was a huge proliferation of life forms, very, very different from the kind that we now observe.
It's the creativity of life is just absolutely staggering, isn't it?
Yeah.
There have been 5 great extinctions in the history of Earth, as near as we can tell today, as we string out the linear story of how things are. Now, science, like every other aspect of human experience, is a set of stories that we try to make a coherent set of stories. And 100 years ago, our stories of evolution were very different from what we have today.
Yeah.
And I see no reason why our story might not be quite different again in the future. But leaving those past future matters aside, the best story we have now is about these cycles of extinction and re-emergence in a kind of improvisational dance of diversity. And we're causing one of those extinction cycles right now, which is very important for us to look at.
One of the other aspects of biology, the most obvious, I suppose, so obvious that most humans don't consider it much, is the division of sexes. I'm male, you're female. That seems to condition so much of our lives, but not all biology works that way. In the one hand, and in the other hand, it seems that in a cosmic sense, there's the negative, the positive, matter, antimatter, that this duality permeates all of nature.
Yes, it does. And one of my favorite creation stories comes from India, in which things start as a smooth sea of milk, the Big Mama image. Right? Call that the plenum, or the source consciousness. And a little wavelet forms. And forever after, the little wavelet is torn between loving its own identity and wanting to merge back into the Big Mama. Now, that to me is the fundamental tension that is the source of all creativity. It's the tension between part and whole. It's the tension between holons in holarchy, to use Arthur Koestler's word for the embeddedness of natural systems. And it gets us to a very interesting pattern in evolution. All life forms are embedded in each other. Each of them has self-interest. Okay? Take the story of evolution as we've been given it since Darwin. Darwin said evolution proceeds through competition among individuals. Someone noticed a lot of altruism within species. And so they said, well, actually it's competition between species. And then Dawkins came along and said, no, both wrong. It's competition among selfish genes. What it really is self-interest at all of those levels. You see, they each had a piece of a puzzle. And if you look at these embedded systems, take your body. Every one of your cells must be able to express self-interest to maintain its integrity. But so do the organs in which they are embedded. And so do the organ systems and the whole body. So each of them, looking to express its self-interest, runs into the others, and the negotiations are forced. Self-interest is good if it's in the context of community. And that's where humans are getting into trouble, because we understand living systems up close, but not at world levels at present.
So there's the dance is one of, on the one hand, competing, on the other hand, cooperating.
Yes. And in young species, the competition prevails. Young species are territorial. They grab all the space they can get. They proliferate wildly with offspring, seeds, whatever, whether it's plants or animals. And as they mature, as they encounter other species with which they must negotiate. So by the time you get to a very mature ecosystem like a rainforest, you have marvelous distributed leadership. Everything knows what to do. Everything cooperates. And the best life insurance policy for a species is how much good product useful to other species, does it put out? That will ensure its survival very nicely.
Now, we're a very young species.
There you go. So we're still at the young grabby stage. And couple that with the fact that we've had this mechanical worldview that reduced nature to mechanism and useful resources for humans. The story we've told ourselves is that we're at the pinnacle of this game and that the rest of nature is there for our use. And those two things together are actually being a young species, and that worldview has combined to put us into the disastrous situation we're in now.
It may be that our very survival as a species, although we probably won't survive over the long run, but it depends upon sort of maturing into the community of life.
Yes, and recognizing that community as sacred, understanding that you can do perfectly good science, seeing nature as sacred.
Elisabet Sahtouris, thank you so much for being with me. We're out of time. And thank you for being with us, and please check your program guides for part 2 of our 2-part program on holistic biology.